Hello there everybody, Sam's Trains here and welcome back to the railway. In today's video we're going to be talking about some of Britain's first diesel locomotives. Ultimately, it would be the diesel that spelt the end for British steam, and it was an end that took quite a long time to come about. So today I want to talk about some of Britain's earliest diesel locomotives, but it's a little bit tricky to pinpoint what some of the earliest diesels were. Now, when I say early diesel, you might think, what, 1930s, 1940s? Well, the answer is no. Some of the earliest diesels were very experimental and they came about in the 1910s and the 1920s, somewhere around there. And as you probably expect, due to the fact that you've never heard of them, they didn't really work very well, and as a consequence we don't really know very much about some of the truly first British diesels. So what I've decided to do for this video is to step a little bit further forwards in time and talk about some of the slightly later, still experimental diesels that really started to shape the diesel that we know today, the diesel that would eventually replace steam. And then towards the end of the video we're going to skip even further forwards in time and I'll show you some of the diesels that literally did replace the steam locomotives during the last 10 years of steam on British railways. So it turns out that it was the LMS that was the driving force behind developing the diesel locomotive. That's the London, Midland and Scottish. And they actually developed one of the very first diesel shunting locomotives. Now, when I say that, I'm sure some experts will nod and say, yes, I know what he's going to say. You're thinking I'm talking about the LMS Class 11, which very much resembles the BR Class 08 shunter, which came later, and indeed it was the Class 11 that the Class 08 shunter was based on. But no, there was a much earlier LMS diesel shunter than this, and that's known as 1831. Not sure where that number came from. I think it might have come from an old steam locomotive, and it was introduced in 1931. And this is what it looks like. It certainly does look a little bit like a steam locomotive, and there's a very good reason for that. So this was introduced 14 years before the LMS Class 11 and over 20 years before the BR Class 08. So this was a very experimental diesel hydraulic shunter, and it would become one of Britain's very first diesel shunters. It was actually built around the frames and running gear of an old steam locomotive, hence the bottom half of the loco looking just like an 060 tank engine. Of course, it did start out as an 060 tank engine. This shunter, though, was not a success. It was underpowered and unreliable, and of course nobody knew what the best practices for running and maintaining diesel locomotives were because the rule book for that hadn't been written yet. So as a result, the locomotive was withdrawn quite early on, 1939, after quite a few years of experimentation and modification, and ultimately, after even more experimentation following withdrawal, it was eventually scrapped. Next up then, we'll talk about something that was a little bit more successful. It's another LMS diesel, but it comes from quite a lot later on. This comes from the late 1940s, when the idea for the diesel locomotive was a little bit more mature. So next up, we're talking about a model I do have, and it is this. This is known as the LMS 10,000, and there was another one of these known as 10,001. And these locomotives were significant because they would be the first ever mainline diesel locomotives. And compared with that LMS shunter we talked about, these were far more refined. So the pair was built at Derby Works between 1947 and 1948, and they were later classified as the D16/1. Like so many early diesel locomotives, these originated from the LMS, who commissioned them, and George Ivat, usually known for his many steam locomotives, was responsible for the overall design work. The LMS would deem these locos to be equivalent to a Class 5 steam locomotive or a Class 7 locomotive when used as a pair. Both locomotives were eventually retired and scrapped after a reasonably short service life, with this example being withdrawn in 1963, only 16 years after completion. So this is another diesel that didn't survive that long. And the driver leans forward in anticipation, as well he should, of course, because these locomotives really would signify the future. I mean, it looks odd and unusual, and you can tell it's early, I think, because of the livery. But if this was painted into a BR blue or a BR green, I don't think it would look like that. I think it would just look like your typical BR diesel locomotive, which is quite impressive given these were built in 1947 and 1948. So now we have a locomotive that really does look like your classic diesel locomotive of the kind that would eventually replace steam locomotives. But we're not quite there yet. As refined as this diesel looks, there was still a long way to go before the diesel locomotive would truly replace steam. Nationalisation of Britain's railways would take place in 1948, and with it the LMS would disappear, meaning that one of the major driving forces behind the development of the diesel would now be gone. But of course the diesel locomotive would continue to be developed by British Railways, and the next loco I'm going to show you is a British Railways one, technically. And that is this, the Fell, which kind of looks like a step backwards from the LMS 10,000, but again, the rulebook hadn't been written. Nobody knew at this point that that Cocoa diesel that we've seen would be a better option than this, which is what, a 484 locomotive, I guess. Yeah, this is not a design that caught on, but it's certainly one that catches the eye, isn't it? So, more officially known as the British Railways 10,100 locomotive, the Fell was also an experimental loco introduced in 1951. Now, I said technically a minute ago, I said it was technically a BR design, but it was actually built by the LMS at Derby Works, but by the time the loco was ready, nationalisation had already taken place. So it actually entered service as a British Railways locomotive rather than an LMS one. The Fell was intended to address some of the perceived weaknesses of the diesel locomotive concept, and it was designed to be lightweight but extremely powerful, exceeding the power of a Class 5 460 steam locomotive. At least that was the brief. The Fell was unusual outwardly as a result of its 484 wheel configuration, featuring external coupling rods, but all of the drivers were actually driven by a single gearbox, hence the wheel configuration 484 and not 4444, or whatever it would be, goodness knows. And this is such a fascinating design because the main gearbox was driven by no less than 4 separate engines, all of them connected to it via a hydraulic coupling. These couplings were used to either connect or disconnect each engine from the gearbox, and the gear ratio and resulting torque was dependent on the number of engines connected to the gearbox at any one time. With a single engine connected, the gear ratio was 4:1, but with all 4 engines connected, the ratio would be 1:1 or unity. And it was this system that functioned instead of gears, as you might see in your car, for example. Now, the last few years of life were pretty rough for the Fell. In 1952, the gearbox was badly damaged after a component came loose and actually fell into the gearing. A few years later, its steam heating boiler caught fire and caused more damage, and a couple of years after that, in 1960, it would be completely scrapped. No other locomotive of this design was ever built. An improved version was under development at one point, but this was never pursued. So even in the 1950s, we still had experimental diesels which were being tried and were considered failures and were scrapped. And that is surprising because at this point we're getting quite close towards the end of steam, and they still didn't seem to have a fully baked idea of what a diesel locomotive would be. But of course they didn't know the end of steam was so close at this point. There was still a lot of work to be done. So the next diesel locomotive is a little bit more normal looking, as you're going to see, and it was also a bit more successful. This loco was a one-off once again, but the design for it was used to create an entire class of diesel later down the line. Now, the chronology is a bit messed up for this one because development started after the Fell, I think, but it was introduced onto the railway before the Fell. So whatever, these two were developed at about the same time. And it is, of course, the BR 10800 locomotive, which again, if it wasn't for this LMS style livery, I think would look just like your typical Bobo small scale diesel locomotive. But no, it was yet another unique diesel locomotive built in 1950, like I say, for British Railways. The idea behind this one was to investigate whether diesel technology was truly suitable to eventually replace steam. Just like all of the other locos today, the 10800 also had its roots in the LMS, and this was another one designed by George Ivatt of LMS fame. And as much as only one was ever built, as I've been saying, this time the loco was considered a success, and it would be the BR Class 15 that was commissioned as a result. That was a modified version of this same design, meaning, yes, this was the first success, arguably. This one would go on to be used again. As for this locomotive, the 10800 itself though, she was withdrawn after less than 10 years in service in 1959, and she was subsequently used by Brush Traction for experiments. After these experiments, she was ultimately withdrawn in 1968 and slowly stripped for parts, finally being scrapped in the mid-1970s. So everything we've seen so far has been relatively small in size, I guess maybe with the exception of the 10,000 locomotive. But the next loco is going to change that entirely. The next locomotive was the first absolute beast of a diesel to get created, and it's also probably, almost certainly, in fact, the most famous locomotive in today's video. It is of course the legendary Deltic prototype. And I don't have a model of this particular engine, although Bachmann has produced one and Hornby is about to release a new one, which hopefully will be even better than Bachmann's. But I've got to feature this one because of how iconic it looks. Now, again, just like with the LMS 10,000, it looks strange because of its livery, but again, if you imagine this painted into a standard BR blue or a BR green, this really would look like your typical early British diesel. So this is known as the DP1 or Deltic prototype. It was built in 1955 and was yet another unique locomotive built by British Railways. There would be more Deltics in the future, but much later on. And this thing was massive. It was 20 meters long, which must have been astonishing for the time. I mean, think of your massive steam locomotives. The Princess Royal was only 22 meters long, and that was including a tender. This locomotive was 20 meters long and it was all locomotive. It also weighed in at 108 tons and it had a tractive effort of around 270 kilonewtons, which is miles more than a Princess Royal class, by the way. Plus it had a top speed of 90 miles per hour, which again gave many steam locomotives, including the Princess, a run for their money. It ran on two Napier Deltic engines built by English Electric, and it took quite a while for people to come around to locomotives like this, which, as you can imagine, were such a departure from the likes of steam locomotives. But eventually this design would take off, and it would be refined and changed and improved until it became a BR Class 55, of which 22 were built. But like I say, not until much later on. This didn't happen until the 1960s. But every loco I've looked at so far was either unique or built in very small numbers, usually just one or two. So as much as these engines were instrumental in the development of the diesel locomotive, they didn't literally help to replace steam. They didn't flood the railway networks and physically replace the steam locomotive. So if we want to know what the first class of British diesel was that was considerably numerous, we have to look at the next engine, which is this. This is the BR Class 20. And for this loco, we are skipping forward by another 7 years or so to 1957. And this locomotive was also known as the English Electric Type 1. Type 1, that sounds like the start of something, doesn't it? And this was not a locomotive built in small numbers. This was a fleet of 228 locomotives constructed over quite a number of years. Yes, starting in 1957, but in 1968 they were still building these. English Electric was still building them. These weighed in at 73 tons, and the class was actually so numerous because it was one of the first diesel designs in this power range to be deemed successful. Given their size, the stats were reasonably impressive. They boasted a top speed of 75 miles per hour and a power output of 750 kilonewtons, although they were often double-headed in order to haul larger freight trains. While not unheard of, the Class 20 did not usually haul passenger trains. Instead, these were used for mixed freight. Interestingly, the class did use steam-era disc indicators prior to the introduction of head codes in 1960, making them a truly classic transitional locomotive between the days of steam and the days of diesel. This truly was the start of something new. And finally, in the form of the Class 20, we have a diesel locomotive that was built in relatively large numbers and became a common sight on British railways. And of course, the rest would be history. Just over 10 years after the Class 20 was introduced, we had the final day of steam on British railways. That was in August 1968. At this point, the diesel locomotive, and to a lesser extent the electric locomotive, had fully transcended the steam locomotive, and it would be diesels and electrics that would drive British railways forward in a slightly more efficient and certainly a cleaner way going forward. So hopefully you've enjoyed seeing some of these early diesel locomotives. I do say some of them because, as you can imagine, there was all sorts of different diesels developed, many of which haven't been produced in model form and probably never will. But if you are interested in more of this, please do comment down below. I could dive deeper if you want to. If you've got any other favourite early classes of British diesel that you'd like to maybe talk about in the comments, feel free to comment. And again, if you've got video ideas for anything along those lines, please do comment and let me know. For now though, thank you ever so much for watching, and I'll see you again very, very soon for another video. Alright, cheers folks, you take care.